game is Winter War. As you can see, perhaps this is a 1972 SPI game. I don't know how terribly ahead of its time it is, but this is one that, for an operational style game that's fairly simplistic, has always kind of pleased me. Now, coming back to it now, and I don't know, it's been maybe 12 years since I've played it. I'm struggling a little with the rules. Not to be surprised, I've apparently gotten older, crankier, and had a harder time with them. But there aren't a lot of them. We're looking at 4 pages of rules. This is not a terribly simple game for 4 pages. They're rather dense rules, and they're written kind of like in more of a GDW style than an SPI style, which to me is a little harder to cope with, however. I think it's a pretty decent game, and I'm going to try to sketch through the rules, but I don't really feel all that comfortable with what the effects are. So, if you really want to get into the details of the rules, you may have to see me as I struggle with their effects as I start playing them. To begin with, this is the initial setup. It doesn't have to be fixed this way. The players have a lot of freedom in their setup, except the Russians can only put their big units near Leningrad, and the Finns can only put their big units along the fortification lines here. There's a lot of different terrain here on this map, actually, and you can see just how many different types. Now, try to compare this to most of the Avalon Hill games at this time, 1972. We're talking about, this is a significantly more detailed terrain, at least, being shown here than I think you see in most games from the Avalon Hill side. You also have 3 numbers on a counter, which, of course, you have your Panzer Leader, Panzer Blitz stuff, which I think is about the same era, and Squad Leader coming out here. But outside of those, for operational level stuff, which those, of course, aren't, having 3 numbers on a unit, an attack, a defense, and a movement, I think is fairly a new concept. You have a lot of on-board and on-map information, most of which doesn't actually exist in the rule book. That's kind of part of the parsimony in these rules, is you have to kind of be aware of all this information, especially if you're playing, as I will be, the advanced game, where you have these special events taking place. And likewise, you have specific scenarios which can come into play for the Finns. Well, both sides get to roll on these event tables of different kinds. It doesn't necessarily affect one side more than the other. Each one's kind of different. You also have nice little order of battle type charts set up. Now that, clearly Avalon Hill already had pioneered that side of things. Combat chart, which is more of an SPI style one with these retreat results in place, as opposed to just eliminate results everywhere. You also have your exchanges, and then you have what these DR, what's this in parentheses? Results in parentheses if they're in Finnish units on fortified hexes. So fortifications are going to be in part taken into effect or into account by the results in the combat table. They're also going to have an effect directly on the odds, however, and both sides have their own combat table, which is kind of useful, which is they're doubled in defense strength. You can only be doubled once, so there's a number of things that can double your strength, like a city and a fort, but you only get a single doubling. All right, let's take a look at the sequence of play. It's not too complicated. By the way, all the units will be face up when the game starts. This is just, the Finns are allowed to set up hidden, and in there, that mix, they have 5 blank counters to help kind of hide what they're up to. And then the Russians get to set up, and I'll flip the Finns over when we actually start the game, or I can maybe flip some over for examples if need be. And a number of different unit types. They don't make a lot of difference in the game. There's no armored exploitation or anything in this sucker. The sequence of play is fairly simple. Each player gets their own turn. We start with the Soviet turn. They get reinforcements, they pull them off the map, or if there's, in the advanced game as we'll be playing, they're going to be rolling an event at that point, and that could also generate some. Movement phase, fairly simple movement here. We've got, of course, the terrain in place, but we also have zones of control. No big shock there. And they're fairly rigid here. Most units have them. A few don't. Headquarters, for example, don't, and Finnish ski units do not. Finnish ski units are largely useless units in a sense, but you can use them to help slip around. They're fairly fast, and they're cheap in the sense that they have no other use. You can slip them around to cut off Soviet supply. And that's really what they'll serve. Anything else here? Yeah, you do have to worry about supply. I don't think you can move out of supply, or maybe you can. Your movement may be affected by that. We'll take a look when we see the supply rules. And then you hit a combat phase. Now the combat phase, some units, like Finnish ski units and Russian headquarters, can retreat before combat. And if they do that, the attacker gets to advance after that retreat. And then, then combats are resolved elsewhere, but units that advanced into a retreating unit space, a unit that retreated before combat space, don't get to make an attack. And then we handle the regular attack, and I believe, we'll see, but I believe there's a possibility for advance after combat. We can look here, retreating units forced to retreat. Okay, one key element to this map is that anything north of row A here, and there's kind of a bit of coloration there to indicate the difference, cannot be stacked. Everywhere else you can have 2 units stacked. There's also larger units aren't allowed north of row A, those larger units being the large Russian army units and the Finnish units. And I think the Finnish ski units aren't allowed south of it, if that really matters. We have some objectives on the map. They're kind of hard to see because they're covered with Finnish units. This is positive, indicates if the Russians own it, they get that many positive victory points. Negative indicates if the Finns take control, they inflict negative points on that. Now, Leningrad actually is not just minus 100, it's an automatic win according to some errata I have here, I believe. And that's pretty fair. I mean, if you can take Leningrad, I think Russia probably will give up on their demands on Finland. Okay, and then you go to the second player turn, and then there's for the optional rules, this is where the random events take place. I thought they happened at the beginning of the turn, at the beginning of a player turn. They don't. They're handled both for both players, and both players basically get a roll on a different chart in order to see what their events are. The Finnish random events happen once at most in a game. Once you trigger one of these scenarios, that rule is in play, and that could involve like Allied landings in Norway or something thrown in to help the Finns here. Some of those can provide victory points to the Russians, I guess, as well. Okay, so for movement, we have, let me see if isolation matters for this. I don't see it mattering. We have a rail movement option, which basically you can spend a movement point to ride the trains in your own territory as far as you like. No real limitation on that I see. Bodies of water, there's minor lakes and rivers. These minor lakes that are just a hex site are treated kind of like rivers. And if you take a look at them, they are fairly limited. They definitely have an advantage on defense, but all they do is really add one movement point. Now the movement point allowances to the units is very low. You'll see most of the units have a 2 movement allowance. Armor has like 3, as do say the ski units and some of the lighter infantry. Now, so 1 movement point can be a big deal there, right? But that's what you have for the game. And the roads also provide no real great bonus here. And the railroads have their own special rules. You can't use them for normal movement. We've already touched on zone of control and stacking. Basic retreat before combat. The Finns can do it actually not just with their ski units. They can also use their 113s to retreat before combat. And that allows them to avoid combat with their enemy. Of course, if they're in a key location, they won't want to do that. You can't retreat into an enemy zone of control. The Russians, it's only the headquarters who can retreat before combat, I believe. Advance after combat if there's a retreat, or advance before combat. If there's a retreat, you're allowed to advance, except for headquarters. So the Finnish do not have to attack Soviet Union units, but the Soviets have to attack Finnish units. What this kind of means is the Finns can advance into terrain in order to force the Soviets to either pull back or actually conduct an attack. Now the Soviet units in general are a little stronger. We'll see that in a bit, especially down here where they're in their heaviest concentration. Isolated units can't attack. There's NKVD units that'll show up at some point or another. I don't think they start on the board. Oh, they do. Darn, where did I put those suckers? That may not have been wise. Well, they can't actually attack into Finland. They only kind of serve as a defensive unit inside Russia itself, and I have actually quite a few of them up here in the Murmansk area, with the thoughts that maybe I could have taken Petsamo, but man, I'll leave it as it is and see what happens. All right. Anything else? Finnish ski patrols, if they choose not to retreat before combat, or cannot for some reason, they have to be attacked, but you don't roll a die, they're just eliminated. And I do not see an advance after combat. Which is kind of an interesting thing for most of these games. So supply and isolation. In general, the Finns don't have to deal with supply, as long as they're in Finland. If they go into Russia, they have to worry about it. They have their own rules for it. But the Russians have these supply cities. And units are in supply if they're... I need to get a headquarters. Shit. I got to reset up here because I can't... Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, this guy wasn't in supply anyway. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now he is. Oh, no, he was. Okay, let me take this headquarters out and put it down here. The reason is I need a headquarters out of Leningrad in order to supply those units. Russian units are in supply if they're actually in a supply city or within 5 hexes of a headquarters unit. And I've set up one headquarters with each kind of frontal area. The headquarters has to be within 10 hexes of a supply city, which makes an attack through here or an attack southward from here difficult, to say the least. That's kind of just a problem the Russians are going to face. They're not going to be able to push all the way down deep into Finland from any of these kind of northern areas easily. Of course, there is something of value up here at Petsamo, which they want to take. See what Finnish supply looks like. I did read these, but they were tough reading for me, and it's easier when I'm speaking aloud, which is one of the reasons I'm doing this. Finnish units are in supply if they can trace back to a point in Finland that's free of Soviet units or zones of control. You don't lose your units because they're isolated, unlike in some games. And friendly units negate enemy zones of control for supply. They don't do so for movement. Now there's special rules on the Murmansk defense. Those aren't in play because we're playing with the scenario options, which means the bad things that could happen, like allies landing at Petsamo, are considered to be factored into the game. So if you want to take your risks and pile on your Soviets, and there's really no great reason not to defend up in the north, you have too many pieces early on with the Soviets anyway. Which you can really kind of see. There's only so much frontage that can really be fought over. And as you go north, well, once you hit here or whatever, 50 is still a pretty big number. Supplying 50 units is quite a few. Okay. Soviet zones of control don't go into fortification hexes if the Finns last occupied them. Fortifications aren't destroyed. If the Soviet player occupies all 4 hexes of the Mannerheim line, then the Finnish player no longer exercises his retreat before combat. But if he regains the Mannerheim line, and that's this fortification line here, then he regains that ability. And I don't know what that's supposed to represent. This is our initial deployment, victory conditions. So victory conditions are these points located on the cities. The Russians need 61 points to get a marginal victory. Now 61 points, this is 30, this is 30. You can't do it without breaking through somewhere else. And that's just the fact of the matter. You have to at least get Vilpuri or something like that. And there are no real points back here. So you really have to crack the lines to get a victory. You can't do it just in the north. And I've set up kind of heavily in the north, but you really don't have too many options with your troops. Because of the limitation on the points on the city, and because you really do have to put fairly significant forces here and here to have any chance, because otherwise the Finns can take something that'll kill you. Okay, well that's about it. Like I said, I've had a lot of fun with this sucker before. I don't really remember why I liked it so much, but I know that with my ex-wife I enjoyed playing it. I haven't gotten a chance with my current one. So we'll load this up and see what happens.